Greetings and welcome to another episode of Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. I am honored to welcome Professor Taya Cohen, Professor of Organizational Behavior and Business Ethics at Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business as our distinguished guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Cohen co-directs the Collaboration and Conflict Research Lab and teaches graduate courses and executive education seminars on negotiation and managing people and teams. Her research explores the causes and consequences of unethical behavior and develops strategies to promote honesty and ethical decision making, with her work published in top journals and featured in major media outlets. A past president of the International Association for Conflict Management, she has received multiple awards and was named among Poets and Cohen's best 40 under 40 MBA professors. Dr. Cohen earned a BA in psychology from Pennsylvania State University, followed by an MA and PhD in social psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before joining Carnegie Mellon's faculty, she completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management in the Dispute Resolution Research Center. In this episode, Professor Taya Cohen offers thought-provoking insights from her research, Moral Character, Having a Conscience at Work. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Taya Cohen to the podcast. Professor Cohen, thank you for accepting our invitation. It is truly an honor and privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Professor, your character lens framework suggests that people with stronger moral character literally see situations differently. Can you explain how moral recognition works as a lens through which people interpret choices?
Sure. Happy to talk about moral character and moral awareness. So maybe to begin, I'll talk about how I see moral character. So I see character as an aspect of individuals that shapes how they think, feel, and behave, or we can see it as reflecting who they are, right? And so if we think of how do we describe a person, what are adjectives we use? And so we can think of personality in that way, of just the way in which we think about ourselves, think about others, and moral character is sort of the moral dimension of personality. And to your question, it sort of asks about moral recognition. And so an important part of a person's character is how do they interpret the situations that they find themselves in? How do they make sense of the world around them? What features of situations do they tune into? Are they particularly sensitive to how their actions affect other people, the potential harms it might cause? If they do something wrong, would they feel bad about it? So these are elements of character that um, are in the background that people kind of go into different situations. Character sort of is a part of who they are, an aspect of who they are that's developed, from the time that they were young children to adults, and is always changing, but there's some stability. And then that shapes the recognition and sensitivity to different aspects of the environment. And then through people's behavior, of course, it shapes the environment they're in as well. And so thinking about, what does the person bring into the situation? How do they make sense of the situation? And then how does that impact their behavior? That's a sort of the aspect of ethical decision making and behavior. I've kind of tried to follow that process and that cycle to understand it.
Professor, in your studies, honesty, humility, guilt proneness, and moral identity centrality emerge as the central dimensions of moral character. Why these three, and how do they jointly shape ethical behavior?
Right. So when I think of moral character, I think of it as a broad concept, kind of like an umbrella concept that encompasses many different specific facets of personality. And so there is a motivational element, so the motivation to do good and avoid doing bad. There's an ability element, sort of the capacity to do good and do bad and avoid doing bad. And then there's an identity side. Do I want to see myself? Do I see myself as a moral person? Is that an important part of who I am? And so there's many different ways in which we might capture these different elements of moral character. And we can look at people's um, behaviors, how what they say in self-report questionnaires, how others describe them, and to do that comprehensively, right, could take a long time. I mean, many hours of assessments to really get a full picture. But what we found in our research by myself, by others, is that with a few short, simple questionnaires that tap into these different elements of moral character, we can get a pretty good sense of this tendency towards ethical versus unethical behavior. So the three characteristics that I have often measured in my studies are, as you highlighted, honesty, humility, guilt proneness, and moral identity centrality, or moral identity internalization, it's sometimes called. Um, so honesty, humility, I'll start with. That is a broad dimension of personality. It's one of the big six hexaco dimensions, um, which is developed by Mike Ashton and Keebom Lee, some Canadian professors who have kind of mapped the landscape of all the different personality characteristics and grouped them into different factors. And what they have found through their research and building on others that had looked at five of these in five-factor models is that we can kind of broadly identify a group of personality characteristics that we may call honesty, humility, which has different facets. People's tendency towards greed versus not, your people's willingness to be sincere in their interpersonal interactions, willingness to exploit others versus avoid exploiting others, their general benevolence. And so one of the reasons I've studied honesty, humility is because it's a broad factor that encompasses a variety of different facets of character. And there's been now several decades of research showing that this broad dimensional personality predicts important life outcomes and important behaviors. It's one of the strongest predictors of um, unethical workplace behaviors, of cooperation and generosity and experimental games. And different researchers all over the world, using questionnaires in different languages, have established that honesty, humility broadly captures people's tendency towards benevolence. So not just honesty and humility specifically, but more broadly being pro-social, cooperative, not willing to exploit others. Whereas the opposite, if you're low in honesty humility, that tends to characterize people who are more Machiavellian, more narcissistic, more willing to take advantage of others. Um, and so honesty humility, you can think of it as broad dimension, and it captures people's motivation to do good and avoid doing bad, and it predicts behaviors. And so that's one of the reasons that we wanted to look at that in our research, is kind of to build on and connect to, other work that is show this important um, broad dimension of personality. Now, the other two dimensions, guilt proneness is a more specific aspect of personality, of moral character, and one that I've spent my career studying and developed various measurement tools to help assess guilt proneness. So, uh, you titled the episode, and I've thought of my work on guilt proneness as having a conscience. And so having a conscience at work is one of the things I think about having a conscience. It's having this internal sense of right and wrong. And when I do something wrong, even if no one knows about it, I would feel bad about my behavior. And that is what this concept of guilt proneness is measuring. And it's associated with a strong sense of personal responsibility. So it's about my own standards and my own. If I am thinking about other people and how do my actions might harm them, then I'm going to make different decisions. As opposed to if I don't really care much about how my actions affect others, or if I don't feel bad about my behavior. So guilt proneness is correlated with honesty, humility, this broad dimension. It's also correlated with aspects of conscientiousness and self-control, because if I don't live up to my standards, if I behave in irresponsible ways, then I would feel bad about it. So it taps into both this motivation to do good and avoid doing bad, as well as the ability side of moral character. Um, and it's a bit more at the intersection. And I think it captures some unique variants as opposed to just the broad benevolence dimension of that honesty humility captures. Um, so those are the two. So honesty humility is a broad, more diffuse characteristic. Guilt proneness more specific, about this having this internal sense of right and wrong, and feeling that sense of personal responsibility to live up to those standards. And then moral identity is important because it captures something slightly different. It's, to what extent do I care about morality? Is this an important part of how I see myself, the person I want to be? I think a lot of human behavior is motivated by people wanting to see themselves in a certain way, and if there's inconsistency, wanting to address that. How do I deal with threats to my self-image? If I want to see myself in a more as a moral person, and then I receive some feedback or information that, that suggests that I haven't behaved in a way that's consistent with that identity, what's that going to motivate me to do? And so some people internalize this moral identity more than others. Most people care about wanting to see themselves as a good person, but some people care more strongly. And that's what this moral identity centralization, or sometimes called moral identity internalization element captures. So that identity piece of moral character. And so, going back to the character lens work, when we were trying in an experiment or in a short survey to assess people's moral character, we would say, what are three different measures we can do in, 10 minutes or less to get a sense of people who are relatively higher versus lower moral character, and not just one narrow piece of it, but broadly. And so that's where we settled on those three characteristics.
Dr. Cohen, you found that individuals high in moral character maintained moral recognition even under pressure to ignore ethical considerations. What does this tell us about resilience in ethical decision making?
So, an important aspect of ethical decision making is to be cognizant of the implications of your choices and aware of the different issues that you might consider. Right? You can still make an ethical decision even if you're not fully aware of what the consequences are. But certainly, when people have ethical blind spots or they're not thinking about broadly about the different issues at stake in a situation, then they may not make ethical choices. And so when moral character is, say, central to a person's identity, when they have this sense of guilt proneness, that they would feel bad if they um, committed a transgression, um, if they're sort of higher in honesty, humility, then that facilitates ethical decision making, even in situations where others might have some ethical blindness, or some maybe thinking narrowly, oh, this is just a business decision. It's not an ethical decision. This is just a financial decision, or this is just an engineering decision or a legal decision. People who are higher in moral character are more likely to say, well, yes, it's a business decision. Yes, maybe it's an engineering decision, but it's not just that. There are ethical implications of my choices here. And in general, the more pressure we have in a situation to prioritize certain issues. So if you're in a business and maybe prioritizing financial considerations, um, or developing new technologies, and that we don't want to miss out to the competition. We want to push forward with innovation. Then that can create a more narrow focus where other with what's been called ethical fading. Some of the ethical considerations get pushed to the background, so they're not top of mind. But for people who are higher in moral character, they are better able to maintain that moral awareness or moral recognition to say, um, yes, there are these pressures, but at the same time, if we make these choices, so there's ethical implications of that. So we need to be very careful in the choices we're making, and evaluate the benefits and risks of different decisions in light of not just the, say, financial or business case, but also the ethical concerns as well.
Professor, you have identified guilt proneness as a powerful predictor of moral behavior. How does anticipating guilt help individuals act more ethically even when no one is watching?
Thank you. So, yes, I've talked a little bit about guilt proneness already and how I think of it as having a conscience. And so to step back, there's a couple clarifications that I think are helpful when thinking about what guilt proneness is. So I see guilt proneness as an element of moral character, so an aspect of personality, which is different than feeling guilty all the time. It's different than feeling ashamed of yourself. Right? So guilt is an emotion. It's a moral emotion. When we do something wrong, do I feel bad about my behavior? Right? Um, and guilt proneness is this tendency to be able to anticipate that if I were to engage in a transgression, if I received too much change at a store and I kept it, and no one noticed and I walked away, to what extent would I feel like the way I acted was bad? was pathetic, or that I should have behaved better. This idea that even if no one knew about what I did, even if it's a small thing, a small transgression or big transgression, would I feel bad about my behavior? Not that I'm then consumed by this, because that would be an unhealthy level of guilt. And not that it means I'm a bad person, because we have to have some self-compassion as well. But do I recognize that if I did a bad thing, I would feel guilty about my behavior? Um, and when people sort of have more of a tendency towards guilt proneness, that facilitates a sense of responsibility. So it's this internal sense that I should do better, that if I do something wrong, I should apologize. I should try to do better in the future, right? We all make mistakes. We all fail to live up to our own standards or other standards on occasion. But then what do we do about it? Um, do we then go hide? Do we try and justify our behavior? Well, if they didn't do this, then I would never have done that. And so we can measure guilt proneness, which is this feeling bad about your behavior when you've done something wrong, versus shame proneness, which is feeling bad about yourself, which tends to be more happen more often in public. If we do something wrong and we're sort of publicly called out for that, or others are aware, then we start to think of ourselves maybe as a bad person. Um, and feeling like a bad person is not feeling that sense of shame is not nearly as a healthy emotion as guilt, right? Because guilt's more narrowly focused on behavior. And for that reason, although guilt and shame can both motivate moral behavior, and guilt proneness and shame proneness can both um, be facilitate ethical behavior in certain circumstances, guilt proneness in particular is associated with this strong sense of interpersonal responsibility, this conscience that motivates people to behave ethically.
Professor, you and your colleagues developed the GASP and G5 scales to measure guilt proneness. How do these tools advance our ability to detect and predict ethical behavior across different cultures and organizations?
So the GASP is the guilt and shame proneness scale. I worked on a project, a scale development project, when I was a doctoral student at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So with Scott Wolf, Abigail Panter, and Chet Insko. And at the time, we were interested in coming up with a tool to measure guilt proneness, because we were trying to understand how do we assess people's tendency towards moral behavior or not. And the insight that really was from my doctoral advisor, Chet Insko, was that, well, how do you study morality? And he said, well, when people do something wrong, they feel bad about it. If and that's more moral of an emotion, and so that got us into this path of studying guilt and shame. And um, at the time, we were trying to understand the different moral norms between interpersonal interactions and intergroup interactions, so that interpersonal one-on-one, when it's me and you, I might feel bad if I don't behave cooperatively. And I would feel bad if I behave competitively or try and take advantage. And people who are higher in guilt proneness or may be more likely to act cooperatively in interpersonal settings. But we wanted to see, well, what happens in an intergroup context when now it's us versus them and me versus you, and I have this strong sense of loyalty to my group and empathy for my group members, and the idea there that, well, I don't want to let my group down. And in the same situation, we might feel guilty for not acting competitively towards others. By acting cooperatively might be sort of seen as a norm violation or a moral norm. And so with that as background, we were looking at what measurement tools were available at the time. There was some incredible work by Professor June Tangy, who had studied guilt proneness with college students and in children, and had done some groundbreaking work there. And when we were developing the gas, we wanted to build on what she and her colleagues were doing, but also integrate it with what some other psychologists were studying, is the difference between what happens when you commit a transgression in public versus private, and also separating the emotional side of feeling bad about your behavior, bad about yourself, from the more behavioral consequences of that, wanting to hide versus apologizing and repairing for what you did. And the measurement tools available at the time, um, developed by Tangy and others, a lot of these elements were sort of merged together. They weren't distinguished. And so with the gas, what was new about the measure we published back in 2011 was we separated the negative behavior evaluations, the negative self-evaluations, and then the behavioral orientations towards repair versus withdrawal. With shame being more characterized by feeling bad about yourself when you commit a transgression in public or that is publicized, and then also the behavioral side of wanting to hide or avoid dealing with the consequences. And people who were relatively higher in shame proneness were more oriented towards withdrawal or feeling bad about themselves. And you measure that independently from guilt proneness, which we measured as having done something in a private transgression. So imagine you commit this private transgression, receiving too much change at a store, breaking a copy machine and walking away. And then what's the likelihood you feel bad about your behavior? And then with the repair side, a subscale looking at what's the likelihood you would take steps to correct for what you did in the future. And anyway, so all that is a long sort of backstory of trying to refine some of the existing measures at the time and distinguish the behavioral elements from the evaluation elements. And what was interesting, if I then look how my career unfolded after that, is we came up with this measure to study undergraduate students interacting in laboratory studies, try in groups versus individually as a way to measure, sensitivity to moral norms. But after that, I then took my first job in a business school when I went to Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, and I started teaching business students negotiation courses. And so I was developing the tool at the time. This is back in 2009 or so. And I said, oh, I have this new measurement tool. Let me see if it predicts, ethical behaviors in the negotiation classroom. And I had the MBA students complete the GASP scale, and then I looked at their behavior over the course of the semester and found that the students who were relatively lower in guilt proneness were more willing to lie to their classmates in negotiation exercises in the course, even, a month later after the assessment. And with that as background, I started doing more studies with different populations, working adults, and over many years have um, continued to see that people who are relatively higher in guilt proneness um, should behave differently. They make different choices, and that's why I've kept studying it for so long. And the GP5 scale they mentioned, the 5 item guilt proneness scale, was a shortened version of the GASP because the GASP is looking not just at guilt proneness but also shame proneness, these behavioral elements, and those are very helpful in for certain research projects. But in my work, because I've been studying ethical decision making and ethical behavior, I wanted just a very short 5 item questionnaire to get a rough sense of a person's guilt proneness. And that's then with later work with Young Jung Kim, former doctoral student of mine, and Abigail Panter, we did some measurement work to develop that short measure.
Fantastic. Professor, your research shows that moral character predicts employee performance and even future misconduct months in advance. How might organizations use this insight responsibly in hiring or promotion decisions?
Yeah. So many organizations care about the integrity of their employees. Integrity testing in businesses is sort of big business. Not all positions require sort of the highest levels of integrity, but certainly most jobs require some level of responsibility. And then in certain organizations, especially those that deal with safety, where some where employees have to go through background checks and irresponsible behavior could cause a risk, safety risk, for example, or in those situations, we might want to get a sense of, who's likely to be a riskier hire, who's likely to behave more ethically, who's likely to treat their colleagues and coworkers well versus engage in mistreatment, which is, a form of unethical behavior. So in one of my projects about 15 years ago or now or so, we ran a 3-month diary study of employees, a weekly diary study, we called it. You can call it experience sampling in a way. So what we did in that project was we gave a battery of personality questionnaires to 1,500 employees across the United States in all different jobs and looked at their moral character, looked at and asked them about aspects of their work, other aspects of personality. And then every week for 12 weeks, we sent them a link to a survey that they completed where they talked about what they did at work that week, how they were treated by others, different behaviors. And some of the behaviors we asked about um, were workplace deviance behaviors. Um, Involving interpersonal deviance as well as organizational deviance. Are you stealing things? How are you treating other people? It's sort of a checklist of different kinds of behaviors related to what's been labeled counterproductive work behaviors, behaviors that harm the organization or the people within it. And what we found for guilt proneness, for honesty, humility, for moral identity, those characteristics, as well as several others, that employees whose self-reports indicated they were lower levels of those characteristics, they engage in more of these bad behaviors. Whereas people who self-reports reveal they had higher levels of those moral character traits, they engaged in fewer of those workplace deviance behaviors. And then we also collected data from coworkers of these employees about what they observed, and we corroborated our findings not just with the self-reports, but with the coworker reports. And so your question about the implications of the of those findings for organizations. And I think what it suggests is some employees are reliably more ethical than others across, their different jobs, across their work. We can measure this. We can measure it reasonably well in research studies where people are anonymous, where they're not trying to create a positive impression. We were outside researchers just asking people about themselves. We were not their organizations or their boss or the company trying to measure. So I do think there's we have to be careful about drawing conclusions, that take what we did in a research setting to a high stakes setting where people's motivations may be quite different. But what the findings do show is that if we can um, measure moral character reliably, and my research gives some insights into what characteristics might be useful, then we can make predictions about people's behaviors, about who's likely to behave irresponsibly or behave unethically. And so, thinking about how we might select for employees with relatively higher moral character than others, I think is an important applied um, implication of our work that I've thought about over the years, trying to think of are there ways we can develop interview questions or assess moral character in these high stakes settings. It hasn't been the focus of my work, whereas I focus more on research context. But I do think there's an opportunity there, given what we know about moral character and assessment, to adapt some of the measures I've created, others I've created, to modify them such that they might be appropriate for more high stakes settings where, job applicants, for example, might be motivated to fake good, to seem more desirable than they are. And, asking questionnaires reveals some information about that. And I have some research suggesting that we can still get a sense of a person's character even in those settings. But certainly if we we're going to scale this up to using this in many organizations where people are motivated to have a positive impression, then we might think a little bit differently about how we measure these very desirable traits.
Professor, in your whistleblowing simulation, individuals high in moral character were more willing to report misconduct. What practical steps can organizations take to encourage ethical, moral beacons to influence others?
Right. So when we think of the situation, you're in an organization, you see some practices going on, you're not sure, they seem maybe ethically questionable, what do you do in these situations? Um, And so I think there's a few different aspects. Your question touches on a few different ideas that I've thought about and written about over the years. One is you mentioned moral beacons. Who in the organization is a guide to others in terms of ethical thought and action. And so um, leaders, beacons, people who are more visible, whether they're in a formal leadership position or just socially, they're connected to a lot of people through their networks who are very central in the networks. They're very visible. And when people are visible, that then shapes the norms of the expectations and the culture of those around them. When you think of organizational culture, how do we create an ethical culture, ethical climate? And the individuals that we elevate to positions of visibility and influence shape that culture. And so we can think a lot about what are the characteristics of those people, what is the visibility of those people, because we don't want these moral islands, just that one person, the ethics and compliance office that no one sees, right? That's not going to shape the culture in a positive way. That's not going to promote the values that an organization might want to promote. So thinking through if we have some individuals in the organization that really embody the values the company wants to espouse, if say they're ethical values, if that's then how to make sure those people are visible, to others, and that their voice is heard, and that that can shape the culture. Um, on a different kind of perspective, you also kind of mentioned or alluded to in your comment about uh, things related to whistleblowing or reporting or what happens when you see something. And I think there's, other considerations there related to some of my other work on honesty and difficult conversations. And so, thinking about how do we promote the speak up culture, maybe as opposed to a call out culture, but how do we promote a culture where people can say things, have difficult conversations, but focused again on behaviors related to guilt proneness, as opposed to focusing on, um, you're just at character attacks where people might feel shame instead of guilt. And so I think when it comes to difficult conversations, there's a motivational side and ability side, similar to what I talked about with character, where on the ability or skill side, can we teach people how to engage in honest conversation, raise issues, raise questions in a way that the other side would be receptive to? Teaching people that these conversations can strengthen their relationship, can even sometimes help things in their career if these conversations are approached in the right way. Going in with humility, recognizing that, well, maybe I see something in the organization, it seems like it could be an issue. So say I'm an engineer, a junior engineer, and I see something that, well, maybe this doesn't seem quite right. Maybe there's a risk there. My manager's telling me that it's not a big deal. Well, should I just listen to my manager or should I raise the issue? But if I raise the issue, maybe the first step would be asking questions. Like, here's how I see the situation. Here's what the employee handbook says. Here's what our specifications. But you have more information about this and different perspectives, so I'd like to learn more about that. So, so for the first step is kind of approaching a situation with questions, raising issues as opposed to just ignoring them, and then seeing, do you get a satisfactory answer? Does it make sense? But if you don't, and then there's actually, you start to get a sense like, oh, there's more going on here. Maybe I don't think this is right. Then giving people the tools, resources to be able to have even more difficult conversations, and that willingness to do so. And the character piece comes through because people have to feel like it is their responsibility to do that. And that's why I think where guilt proneness becomes important, because I think there can be this tendency to shirk that responsibility. Well, there's an issue, I've raised it, I did my part, I still think there's something going on, but somebody else will deal with it. I've done all that I can. And that mindset that it's not my responsibility, it's other people's responsibility. I'm not personally going to feel bad about it because I can justify that. I think that can let unethical behavior escalate and people can become complicit in ways where if we have leaders or employees with higher levels of moral character, higher levels of guilt proneness, for example, then they may feel that personal responsibility to address the wrongdoing, and then couple that with skills we can teach people about how to have effective but difficult conversations, and having leaders who appreciate that, support that, and um, encourage that culture, right? Maybe the combination of these things can help us avoid some, difficult ethical problems or scandals or disasters.
Professor, in your research, you argue that honesty is more than the absence of lying. It's also about fostering accurate understanding in others. How should this change the way leaders and employees think about honest communication?
Thank you. So after studying character for a number of years and still studying it today, back in 2018 or really 2016 to 2020, 2023, I started to do a deep dive more into honesty specifically, and this relates to the difficult conversation. And along with several collaborators, Emma Levine and Will Fleeson and some other colleagues, we started thinking a lot about honesty and wanted to review what we knew about honest behavior. And so in 2023, we published this paper in Academy of Management Annals that offered a new framework for thinking about honest behavior. And so this is what you're referencing in the question, that honesty is more than the absence of lies. How do we foster understanding of the truth in others? Um, and this came out of discussions our research team had and our reflections that there had been a lot of research in psychology, in management, in behavioral ethics about looking at people, do people lie for a certain amount of money or not? And cheating in these sort of laboratory paradigms, or if you roll a dice and you get a certain amount of money for rolling a six, do people lie to say they got the six or overreport their performance in some way? And so we started to see a lot of experiments in that area, hundreds in economics and in psychology and in business journals. And one observation that we have, well, lying and honesty, it's not just about those types of decisions. Do people lie to gain some material advantage? And that happens. That's an important aspect of behavior. But what about all these other situations where people might deviate from the truth, where it's not a clear lie, right? It's not me making a false statement or a material misrepresentation, but maybe I'm withholding some information, or maybe I use truthful information to mislead you, a behavior called paltering. So when you think of negotiations, people use all kinds of communication tactics that are not just outright lying. And so we embarked on a major review of a systematic review of the literature to see what do we know about honesty. And we developed a model that is a dyadic model of honest behavior. And so it incorporates both the communicator perspective. Do I make a false statement or not? What's the content of the communication? Is it true versus false? Is it based in truthfulness? But also, what about the recipient of that information? What impression do they come away from the conversation with? Um, does the communication foster an understanding of the truth in the listener? Even if it's not an outright lie, maybe it's through disclosure or a lack of disclosure. Maybe it's through the tone or the delivery of the information. If a CEO is on an earnings call speaking really fast and with a very positive tone, is that obscuring important information about the actual financial health of the company, for example? And there had been some papers that had looked at things like this, thinking about honesty, but they weren't nearly as prevalent as some of the other laboratory-based work looking at lying. And so through our review, we wanted to say, look, honesty is much broader than just what the communicator says or doesn't say. It's about disclosure, it's about the delivery of the information, and it's about the intellectual honesty as well. When we think of, one of the issues, face society today with misinformation and the spread of information, and information can be shared so easily. What level of responsibility does a communicator have to fact check that information before broadcasting it? And if I am willfully ignorant and continue to share information and communicate false information, maybe I believe that it's true, but is there some level of responsibility to foster understanding the truth in others? And what level of responsibility does the communicator have? What level of responsibility does the recipient have? These are important questions. And if we just think narrowly about honesty as does a person lie or tell the truth, we miss that intellectual honesty piece about truth seeking. How much do people really um, fact check or search for information before communicating, sort of before you even say anything? At what level do you kind of ensure that honesty might result? And then the fostering understanding, thinking of what impression does the listener have, and then the responsibility there. What question, when you're a recipient of information, what do you speak up about and say, well, I have a question, I didn't quite understand that. Can you clarify? Because I think there's a responsibility there too. It's not just on the communicator. And Anyway, so this framework of honest behavior is much broader, I think, than how many people are thinking about honesty when they're thinking narrowly about does a person lie or tell the truth.
Professor, your work shows that people often overestimate the negative consequences of being honest. What can managers and teams learn from your findings on benevolent honesty in feedback conversations?
Thank you. So one of the favorite studies that I've worked on in my career was with Emma Levine, who's now a professor at University of Chicago. When she was a doctoral student in Philadelphia at University of Pennsylvania, we conducted a study, really Emma conducted the study where we had people be honest in all their conversations throughout their life for 3 days, versus be kind in all their conversations throughout their life for 3 days, or just be mindful. And what we wanted to test in this study and the studies that followed was, what are the consequences of honesty in people's daily lives or kindness in their daily lives? And what do people think it will be like, and what's it actually like? And when we first were about to embark on this study, it's about 2016, I believe, is when in 2017 when Emma ran these experiments. We weren't sure what we would find. We thought, oh no, we're asking people to be honest. Is this going to be a disaster? We called it the challenging exercise study, and we make sure people fully were willing to commit to this. What we found surprised us. It surprised the people in the studies, and it has implications that you highlight in your question about how people expect honesty and honest conversations, difficult conversations, to go much worse than they actually do. And so when we had individuals be honest in their conversations, they thought it would not be enjoyable. They thought it would damage relationship, cause conflict. And in reality, when people did this, it ended up strengthening their relationships in different ways that they didn't expect. It led to trust in ways people didn't expect. And it was much more enjoyable. And even when the conversations were hard. And this was true in interpersonal situations, it was true in workplace interactions. Not in every case, of course. Sometimes people really did have difficult conversations that caused conflict. But when people reported on those experiences, they said, yes, this was difficult. And and I broke up with my partner, through this study, but we needed to have this conversation. I'm so glad it happened. And it um even if it was not strictly enjoyable, it still created a lot of benefits for people in ways they didn't anticipate. And overall, it was very helpful. And this relates to then feedback as people go into feedback conversations, which is an example of a difficult conversation, thinking that the recipient is going to respond much more negatively than they do, that um, the communicators often focus on the short-term awkwardness or emotional harm that these conversations might cause. And what we often neglect, what many neglect, is that there is a value in communicating truthful information that people can learn, that um, when a person is honest, that shows that, and they do it in a way that is considerate, right? So it's not just brutal honesty where that's rude, right? That's more the delivery. But what about what you mentioned, benevolent honesty, when I care about the well-being of the other side? And the reason I'm providing these honest comments and feedback is because I care about you and I want to help you understand things that I see, right? And the information that I have. And so feedback in particular, sometimes people focus much more on the short-term harms of these conversations and they neglect what my colleague Emma Levine has called the instrumental value of truth. And that's often a long-term benefit, that I'm sharing this now because it can help you for the future, as opposed to you continuing down a path that may not be beneficial for your well-being or for your career success. And so in my current work, we've been building on those findings to help one highlight to people that difficult conversations, feedback, for example, can have these benefits. It can actually strengthen relationships as opposed to harm them. Often the benefits may be longer term, whereas we focus so much on the short term issues. Um, but also that there's a way we can have these conversations well, and skillfully, and thinking about how we can train students, for example, to have these conversations to address issues early so they don't escalate, and to feel some confidence in behaving honestly, because most people do want to be able to have hard conversations and have the skills to do that. Thinking through, what would motivate people to engage in difficult conversations rather than avoid conflict. Because, when we avoid conflict, it can often lead to further problems down the road because issues aren't being addressed.
Dr. Cohen, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. You are exploring ways to detect moral character in high-stakes contexts like the Department of Energy's Human Reliability Program. How might moral character assessments reshape how institutions manage insider threat risks?
Thank you. So you mentioned one of my new projects, recent projects that I'm very excited about, and we'll see how it unfolds. So building on my work on character assessment, I mentioned earlier that for some organizations, this is a critical concern. And when you have employees handling nuclear materials, for example, if employees are irresponsible, and or susceptible to, say, insider threat, if they, or have a tendency, towards covering up mistakes or things like this, and that's a huge risk. It's a societal risk, it's an organizational risk. And so organizations that work in this space, they do a lot of psychological testing to ensure that the employees they hire, the people they give security clearances to, are responsible, trustworthy employees. And often in those contexts, we look for things like, does a person have a history of alcohol or drug use? Do they have any mental health issues that would, compromise their trustworthiness? Do they have financial debts that could compromise their trustworthiness or make them susceptible? What psychological testing in this area has not traditionally focused on are what I would call moral character traits, things like guilt proneness or conscientiousness or honesty, humility. These personality characteristics that are associated with more trustworthiness, more ethical behavior. We know a lot from research in laboratory studies or in surveys, self-reports, coworker reports, sort of research settings that are not high stakes, that these character traits can be measured, that they predict trustworthy behaviors that would be relevant to those kinds of jobs. What's harder, of course, is what about in high stakes settings where people are motivated to look good? And are there ways, in addition to questionnaires or beyond questionnaires, that we can assess these important character traits to complement what organizations are already doing in terms of psychological testing? And so through one of my new collaborations, I am working with the organization to incorporate some measures of character assessment like guilt proneness, certain behavioral interview questions that might help us get a sense of the trustworthiness of employees. And it's important to recognize that there's not just one surefire way, there's not just one question you can ask that will elicit that information or that would be completely diagnostic of a person's character. But through using different assessments and multiple tools, we can get a sense. And so if a person scores low in guilt proneness, for example, with the self-report questionnaire, we can think about what questions we'd want to ask them in interviews. How do we get a clearer picture of their character, with the idea that by triangulating, through different approaches, we can get a sense of an employee's trustworthiness and only be giving security clearances to employees who we are confident would not be a risk for untrustworthy behavior or irresponsible behavior.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taya Cohen, for sharing your invaluable insights with us today. Your research on moral character, ethical decision making, and the causes of unethical behavior provides not only a deeper understanding of human behavior at work, but also practical guidance for creating more ethical and collaborative organizations. We are grateful for the time and wisdom you have shared, and I am certain our listeners will take away lessons that can make a real impact in their professional and personal lives. On behalf of Business Talk, I want to express our sincere appreciation for joining us today. We hope to continue following your work and perhaps have you back in the future for more enriching conversations. Thank you once again, Professor Cohen, for this truly enriching discussion.
Thank you.